Kids going to junior church. And the rest of you, if you would, take your Bibles, look over to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. I picked up this poem, which reminded me of the clip that you just saw about being left behind. And it's getting close to that holiday season. I'll be honest with you, I've probably seen it for about 45, 50 times, but I always loved watching the Charlie Brown, The Great Pumpkin, correct? That is a classic. It always turns out the same way every year, but I just want to watch it. And then it leads into the holiday seasons, which I picked up this kind of holiday-sounding poem. It goes like this. "'Twas the night before Jesus came, and all through the house, not a creature was praying, not one in the house. Their Bibles were laying on the shelf without care, and hopes that Jesus would not come there. The children were dressed to crawl into bed, not once ever kneeling or bowing a head. And Mom, in a rocker with babe on her lap, was watching the late show while I took a nap. When out on the east there rose such a clatter, I sprang to my feet to see what was the matter. Away to the window I flew like a flash, tore open the shutters and threw up the sash. When what to my wondering eyes should appear but angels proclaiming that Jesus was here, with light like the sun, sending forth the bright ray. I knew in a moment this must be the day. The light of His face made me cover my head. It was Jesus returning just as He said. And though I possess worldly wisdom and wealth, I cried when I saw Him in spite of myself. In the book of life which He held in His hand was written the names of every saved man. He spoke not a word as He searched for my name. When He said, "It's not here," my head hung in shame. The people whose names had been written with love He gathered to take to His Father above. With those who were ready He rose without sound. With all the rest were left standing round. I fell to my knees, but it was too late. I had waited too long and thus sealed my fate. I stood and I cried as they rose out of sight. Oh, if only I'd been ready tonight. That's remind you of that little film clip that you saw. I thought it was pretty funny, didn't you think so? Now you're probably wondering, what should happen if the Lord should come and you came up here and I was not here to preach? Here's your answer. We have Jay to preach to you, just in case. No, I'm just kidding. But we're not on camera yet, are we? We are? Okay. All right. All right. It was just a joke. I'm just joking, Jay. But you know, as I said that, although it sounded like that Christmas story, there are Christians who fear, wondering if that poem would apply to them. And I pray not. Because there are people, honestly, who think, have I been good enough to make it? Or maybe I haven't been as faithful as I should have been. Or maybe I did something stupid and it's kind of unpardonable. Will I make it? I wanted us to go to 2 Thessalonians. We've been looking at a series of messages here, and here we come to chapter 2 of it. And to be honest with you, I want us to look at it with some of the eyes that the original readers read it, or the way they heard it for the first time when it was read in the pulpit. Because whenever I hear or see a passage, it makes me to ask some questions. And no doubt the original listeners, and we have some questions when we look at this word. Like question number 1 that they had in mind when they read this and heard this was the question, did they miss Jesus coming? Let's look at verses 1 and 2 if we can of this passage. Paul said, "Now concerning the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and our being gathered to Him, we ask you, brothers, not to become easily unsettled or alarmed by some prophecy, report, or letter supposed to have come from us, saying that the day of the Lord has already come." Every week I like to read other people's sermons. There's a side of which I read. And I was reading about this one preacher who had a friend, and he was asked by a certain preacher of another denomination this question. He said, "Brother, if you died today, are you sure you'd make it to heaven?" Well, to be honest, this preacher's friend wasn't 100% for sure. And then that preacher proceeded to cite the friend's uncertainty as proof that he was not saved. That is, if you did not feel your salvation was secure, then you weren't a Christian. It's interesting because when I go back at this passage, Paul doesn't say that to this audience. Instead, Paul teaches that the central issue of salvation wasn't what you felt as much as what you thought and how you reacted toward the truth. Let's look down at verse 10 toward the end of this passage where Paul said, "And every sort of evil of evil that deceives those who are perishing, they perish because they refused to love the truth and so be saved." Now, by contrast, we look at verse 13, which reads this: "But we ought always to thank God for you, brothers, loved by the Lord, because from the beginning God chose you to be saved through the sanctifying work of the Spirit and through belief in the truth." You see, it was their belief that saved them. It's our belief that saves us, not so much our feelings of savedness. Those who were loved by God were those who believed the truth. Those who would perish would be those who refused to love the truth. It was that simple. And there's that dividing wall. But let me go on with the passage because there's another big question. And I don't have it listed back there, so I'm going to read it to you. It's verses 3, I think, following to 7, 8, or 9. But Paul says, "Now let no one deceive you by any means, for that day will not come unless the falling away comes first, and the man of sin or the man of lawlessness comes, who opposes and exalts himself above all that is so-called God or that which is worshipped, so that he sits as God in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. Do you not remember that when I was with you, I told you these things? And now you know what is restraining, that he may be revealed in his own time. For that mystery of lawlessness is already at work. Only he who now restrains will do so until he is taken out of the way. And then the lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord will consume with the breath of his mouth and destroy with the brightness of his coming. The coming of the lawless one is according to the work of Satan with all power, signs, and lying wonders." Well, I'm going to look at it. Paul brings it up. You know, we can pretend it's not there, or say we don't feel comfortable or knowledgeable about it, can dance around it, we can evade it, but it won't go away. But it makes me ask the question. It made them ask this question. Who is this man of lawlessness that Paul talks about? Well, I'm going to tell you right here and now who it is. I don't know. Paul doesn't identify him by name. And in fact, this is the only place in the Bible you see the term, the man of lawlessness. And I've read some other sources trying to identify this guy. In fact, we have lots of books out there that you're willing to check out if you want to. And it has all different answers from all over the place and all periods of history. And it's according to who you read. Some have speculated that this fellow that Paul is talking about is the Emperor Titus, who would later come in and destroy Jerusalem in AD 70, about 20 years later than what he wrote to these folks. That maybe he entered the tabernacle, and as an emperor he constituted himself as a god. Some would say it would be another Jewish person who acted just like Herod Agrippa when he executed the Apostle James, that he set himself on a throne and said he sounded like a god, and God struck him down. He is eaten with worms. I know it's rather grotesque. There was a Jewish man by the name of John Levi of Gashela who was instrumental during the Roman siege. At 3.5 years within the siege, he stopped the sacrifices, and some people think he might have been that person. And other people take another different view and consider the lawless one maybe to have been one of the popes in history, that he was the vicar of Christ in the 7 hills that Revelation talks about. And there are some that you see popularized in that Left Behind books. By the way, we have a lot of those in the library, so many we didn't even have room out there, but you're welcome to go back there. And the idea there would be a guy who had come along and maybe become head of something like the United States of Europe, and he'd come about the time when Jesus comes back, and he'd befriend the Jewish nation, and 3.5 years in, he becomes a stinker and sets himself in the temple and kills off 2/3 of the Jews. And you have a bunch of different ideas. Now, this guy has been called different other titles, and there are different views there. Some call him the Antichrist, and no doubt He will be an Antichrist. Over in 1 John chapter 2 and chapter 4, Paul talks about an Antichrist, and he says anybody who denies that Jesus is Christ and denies that He came in the flesh. In fact, John doesn't use that term in the book of Revelation, just there in 1 John. People identify him as the beast, and some say it was the Emperor Nero in the old days, or that there was a land beast and a sea beast. The sea beast was the Emperor Nero, the land beast was a Jewish hierarchy, with the Herods persecuting Christians. Some people identify him with those numbers 666. Some thought if you take letters and put them with certain numbers, you get 666 like Nero did. And some say, well, you could do that. You can get Jane Fonda with that. And some even point out Ronald Wilson Reagan. Some refer to this beast with a bunch of different heads and horns, and they look at every U.S. president we've had, and even the U.S. Presidential candidates. You know, some people even call Rush Limbaugh that great beast with those horns. Now, be honest with you, I don't know how many horns Rush Limbaugh has, but I kind of have my doubts with it. But there have been brighter minds than myself that studied this over and over and over again. There was an aspect of a book that's out there written by Bob Lowry, and I had him for a class, and he gave a very interesting perspective on the book of Revelation. He says there's got to be something that meant to that crowd that read it, and it's got to mean something to our day today. Because it wouldn't have helped them back then, as their loved ones are being hauled off to persecution, to think, 2,000 years from now, things are going to get better. As our loved ones are being hauled off now, that there's some guy that's got this number. And there's got to be something for the later days, otherwise it would be called the book of prophecies. But I think such study would be helpful. It was helpful to those people at Thessalonica. And it should give us comfort and encouragement. It should make us vigilant and let us understand that time is running out. Time is short, and there's still countless millions headed to a Christless grave until we step in and do something about it. Now I'm going to do what's called a little bit of audience criticism here. That there's got to be a reason why Paul wrote this passage to these people. Understand that these were folks who thought that through a forced message, they missed Jesus coming again, and they were doomed. And Paul's pointing out, folks, you didn't miss it. In fact, these things have to happen before Jesus comes back again. One was this guy that he talks about. They point out there are other signposts to let us know that this world is not going to last forever. And again, I want to be careful here, because I remember back in the 70s, I read a bunch of stuff. I saturated with a bunch of stuff. I saw the leaflets like the multiplication of vultures in the Middle East, about the Armageddon and eating up all the dead people there, a supercomputer in Europe. By the way, you want to know where the biggest, fastest computer is in the world right now? It's in China. Even they're getting that stuff. Social Security checks coming out with the 666 on them. An Ashen heifer being born in the early 80s, which that cow would probably be dead by now. The Indians talking about a white buffalo being born. But, there's all those speculations. But I think there are some other sure signposts. One is nature itself. Some would talk about all this weather phenomenon we've been having in recent years. They had bad weather in the first century, and some would say, well, because we have better techniques to measure it. Even Romans chapter 8 tells us that the earth is groaning in our subjection and wants to be free. It's kind of like body pains. You know what I'm talking about? Every day you get up, you have an ache and a pain. Just the other day, my wife wanted to go over to Brown County to see those pretty leaves on the trees, and we did that. To be honest with you, I thought I'd just look out my window and see trees the same color. And later that day, I was with the rake, raking up leaves, and I was mumbling some stuff. Speaking in tongues, I think, something like that. But we went up there to see the leaves with all the other people, and my daughter wanted to go up the fire tower. How high is that thing? But we thought, we're game, we'll do that. And I think we made it up there. There had to be about 250 steps, going up there. And I'm about ready to have a coronary, about halfway up. But we finally made it. And we made it back down, and we felt proud of ourselves. Got up yesterday morning, and I thought, man, I can't get those things to move. Oh! getting up those stairs, there's not 250, there's only 1, 2, 3, 4, but it was a challenge. I mean, even after all that biking, you let us go through and all that. But it's just like body pains. It reminds you that this body of ours is not going to last forever. And all the weather and all the bad things that happen on planet Earth lets us know that this world is not going to be around forever also. Also, many folks have pointed out about the rampant evil in this world, that the old devil knows that his time is getting short. He doesn't know when, but he knows his time's getting short. So he's really fighting with full vengeance with all the crime and violence upon God's men and God's people. As I told you, there are no less than 300,000 people who are martyred as Christians every year just because they say they're Christians. You could talk about all the different things, all the unborn, the last generation, and the tens of millions around the world that's been, taken before they were born. You could talk about all the coup attempts and all the genocides that's happened in the past nation. But there is one point that's gotten everyone's attention. And it's the fact that this little country, Israel, became a nation again. We've been studying in the Minor Prophets, the book of Hosea, and there's a passage, I think it's Hosea chapter 3, verse 5. And God tells Hosea that the children of Israel will be reunited again. Now that's an interesting passage, no matter how you divvy it up. But I've heard people of different understandings of the last days even point this out. That when Hosea spoke, he was talking to the 10 northern tribes. Within a few years of Hosea speaking that, they were conquered by the Assyrians and they were taken 1,000 miles out east as slaves. Now, the 2 southern tribes were the tribes of Judah. They would be conquered with the next empire, the Babylonian Empire, and hauled away. But some of them would come back 70 years later when Persia became the empire. But the 10 northern tribes never came back until in some of your lifetime in the 1940s. Makes some question, is there a purpose with that? Is it just a sign that the time is getting here, or God had something to do with those people? I'll let the experts debate that. But I think it's all a wake-up call that God's going to keep His word. He said Jesus is going to come, and mind you, He's coming again. But that leads me to a third question. As I forayed into that, why point all this out? Again, when you look at the passage in whole, the lawless one is not really just the main focus here. He used it as information to point out that Jesus hadn't come yet. And despite that, some of the false teachers were telling them, Paul wanted to encourage and assure the believers of their salvation. It's interesting that those were people there that were going to perish because, he said, they refused to love the truth. They've made their decision about Jesus, and they refused Him. Romans chapter 1, verses 18 and 19 points out these words. He said, the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all godlessness and wickedness of men who suppress the truth by the wickedness. Since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. He said, when the Lord comes again, no one's going to have an excuse. Apparently in everyone's life, there comes a point where a decision is to be made. And in that decision, they either decide for the things that please God or for the things that's going to please themselves. And when that time comes, there are people who erect walls between themselves and the truth because the truth isn't what they want to hear. Or they decide the truth is only what they think it's going to be the truth. Truth is what fits their experience or their expectations. But it's what they want to hear that's going to be truth to them, and they'll settle for nothing else. I think of another Charlie Brown. By the way, they're coming out with a new Charlie Brown movie, are they not? When's that start anyway? November 6th, okay. We're going to have to go there for Haley's sake, okay? Okay. I love Charlie Brown. It's always good. Matter of fact, every year I get a birthday card from Sherry. It's always about Charlie Brown. I always love that. See, I do pay attention to things. I appreciate that. But I also love their Christmas special. I love that. And that reminds me of this story about a little boy, 4-year-old boy, he's going out with his grandpa. They're looking for the perfect Christmas tree. They look and look and look and look and look and look. It's getting toward the end of the day. And grandpa says, well, we're just going to have to cut down the next one. And the boy looked up with sad eyes and he says, you mean even if it doesn't have lights on it, Grandpa? You see, the deal was, for that boy, just any old tree wasn't going to work for a Christmas tree. For him, the only tree worthy of being a Christmas tree was one with lights on it. That's what he's looking for, and it's the only thing he would settle for and nothing else. As long as he looked for such a tree, he wasn't going to get a real tree. Now, here's the fourth question. I think I have 6 in all. What happens when people refuse to love the truth? Well, they open themselves up for deception and delusion. They'll accept falsehoods. They'll accept half-truths. They do it because it helps them to live their lives the way they want to and to help justify the decisions they'd otherwise be ashamed of. In an issue of Focus on the Family, there's a lady who remembered what it was like when she was growing up in the first grade. Remember when you're in the first grade? I bet some of you can't even remember beyond the day when you were married. I had some old-timer says, I can't remember not being married. But it's a great thing. But she sat behind this girl who brought a gift, a Christmas gift to school. She put it on her desk. I mean, it was wrapped in white glossy paper, tied up with silver, and with the bow, red bow on top. And he says, immediately I was captivated. I've never seen anything so exquisite. Day after day, the tiny gift caught my eye, and my active imagination tried to guess what miniature treasure might be on the inside. She said, I long for that object with all the power a 5-year-old can muster. Finally, I became convinced that it should be mine. I deserved it because I desired it. Since I rode the school bus early every day, it was a simple matter to slip into the empty classroom one morning, and my hands eagerly tore into that tiny present, and inside I found nothing. A lot of folks, and maybe us from time to time, we want something so bad that we just have to have it, and after we get it, then it's not really anything. It's not really anything. The book of Ephesians talks about people who've had their conscience seared and calloused. I mean, they've lived so long in falsehood that they don't realize how empty their gift boxes have become. Let me go to before we get to question number 5, Christy. Pilate was an excellent example of this. In the gospel stories, he is willing to do whatever it took to keep his power in Jerusalem. Even when the simple young man stood before him, he knew as clear as day he was innocent. But just because the hierarchy kept pushing for him and asking for his job, he would do whatever it took to keep his job, even if it meant crucifying a perfect person. I like this exchange between Jesus and Pilate. It's over in John chapter 18, verses 36 and 37. Where it said, Jesus answered. I'm going to go ahead and read it to you. He says, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight so that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now my kingdom is not from here. Pilate therefore said to him, are you a king then? Jesus answered, you say rightly that I'm a king. For this cause I was born, and for this cause I have come into the world, that I should bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. But Pilate didn't care about the truth. In fact, he already decided that there was no ultimate truth. And so he refused to accept that Jesus knew anything about absolute truth. But that leads me to a 5th question. What is truth? Jesus had this to say about the Bible and truth over in John 17:17. He says, sanctify them by the truth. Your word is truth. Folks, if you want a book to heal your heartaches and to give you guidance and comfort for your soul, look to the Bible. If you want a book that will reveal your inner weaknesses and teach you to become a better person, look into the Bible. If you want to know what God's will is for your life and you want to know how to please Him, look in the Bible. The Bible is truth only because it tells us about the source of all truth. Jesus said this to His disciples, I tell you the truth. He said it no less than 31 times in the book of Matthew. And He's called one full of grace and truth. Jesus said to His disciples, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Jesus is the truth, and if you know Him, and if you love Him, and you follow Him, you can be assured of salvation, no matter how you feel. And one last observation I'm going to make, and one last question. We see this over in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 11 and 12, as we end out this passage in our visit with 2 Thessalonians today. For this reason, God sends them a powerful delusion so that they will believe the lie, and so that all will be condemned who have not believed the truth, but have delighted in the wickedness. And I ask this question. What about this delusion thing Paul's talking about? Question 6, what about this delusion? Who sends it? Did you notice it says God does? And to be honest with you, a lot of folks seem uncomfortable with those words. I felt uncomfortable in reading it. But you know, it might make a lot of sense when you think about it. That is, God will eventually give you what you want. I mean, if you want to refuse to love the truth, God will give you what you want. As I said, God is so much a God of love, He is not going to make someone live in heaven who chose in his life that he didn't want to be around God. If that's what you want, okay, you don't have to be around me for all eternity. You don't have to be around me. That's how much I love you. Now you think, who would choose that? But people are choosing that left and right every day. But if you want to choose to know the truth and you want to choose to be in God and find a way to get there, He will make a way for you to get there. So here's my last question. And maybe it's the question that Paul wanted to give them. What do you want? What do you want? If Jesus came right now, what would you want? How do you want to face standing before God? Will it be as someone who refused to love the truth, or someone who has believed and embraced it? And that's the question. Just what do you want? I hope you choose the latter, then you go with Jesus. Of course I'd say that, because that's the way to go. That's the way to go. By the way, Jay is preaching next week, and it has nothing to do with the Lord comes. If the Lord comes here before then, I won't be here and He won't be here, and I pray you won't be here either. Are you assured of that? Jesus said, you believe in God, believe also in me. He tells us plainly how to get together with Him. I mean, how many times over 13 years times what, about 50 times? That's a whole bunch of times. Hundreds of times I've told you the same thing. And I'll tell you nothing different. Believe in God, believe also in me. I'll tell you this, unless you repent and turn your life around, you will perish. He says, whoever is willing to confess me before men, him will I confess before my Father in heaven. And he who believes and is baptized will be saved. Is there someone that needs to think about doing that? Needs to talk to someone about doing that? Or just pull the trigger and do that? We welcome you to come. If someone just needs to recommit their life to say, I've been listening to some falsehoods, I need to get into truth. I need to get into the truth. Or maybe there's someone just needs to join up in our fellowship of believers, or have someone to pray with you. Right now, Jay, I'm going to have you come up and lead us in that song, and I want you to stand as we sing it together, and I want you to mean it. And if you need to do something about it, do something about it.